freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. As always, I am your host, Nico Perino, and as sometimes the case, today I'm also joined by my boss, FIRE President and CEO, Greg Lukianoff. Hi, Greg. How are you? You're in your new office.
Yep. I got a window. It's kind of exciting.
You had a window before.
Oh, yeah, but this looks at things.
Coming up in the world. Oh, I shouldn't say anything. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, you can say anything. It was Greg's idea, Caitlin, to have you on the podcast. He's, I know, always been an admirer.
I'm a huge fanboy. I love her stuff. Oh. You're amazingly unafraid of going into all sorts of controversial topics all over the map. I admire your wit, your style, and your bravery as a journalist.
Yeah, let me give the full bio here, and then
I was just about to say, because my father very famously, and this was he taught at Berkeley forever, and he gave this introduction to somebody, and it was just evidently my father was extremely funny, and it was just the greatest introduction. It was like 25 minutes long, and nobody cared because it was so great. And then the speaker came up and he said, "Thank you so much, Tom. I have only two things to add to that. My name is Richard Ellman, and my subject is James Joyce."
It's actually our podcast listeners might know, a recent podcast I had on Bob Corn Revere, who's a lawyer in the First Amendment community. And I just he's been on the podcast so many times, I just forgot to say that he was a lawyer with Davis Wright Germain. I was just like, oh, Bob Corn Revere, and he wrote a book.
Right.
But hopefully most of our guests recall Bob from the previous podcast. But you, Caitlin, you are a staff writer with The Atlantic. You're an author of two books, Girl Land and To Hell with All That. And your writing is wide-ranging. I listened to you on Barry Weiss's podcast talking about abortion. I listened to you on Persuasion talking about free speech and many other things in preparation for this. Okay. But we at FIRE have been interested in what you've been writing for many years now. You wrote about Title IX and due process, which is obviously an issue we work on. You also wrote about comedy in higher education.
Oh, so, yes.
A little bit of background here. Greg and I worked on a movie with Ted Balaker called Can We Take a Joke, which is about censorship in comedy and Lenny Bruce. And the main thought behind it, and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think it was your idea, was like Lenny Bruce would not survive a minute on the modern college campus.
Oh, no.
And we came out with that movie in November of 2015, and your article, That's Not Funny, came out in September 2015. So we
Oh, good. I thought you were going to say it came out the next month and that I had tripped the whole movie, and now I'm pretending I haven't seen the movie. Okay, good.
No, you scooped us. You scooped us. And it was fascinating because you talk about the National Association for Campus Activities and the sort of comedy that comes out of that. So if you could wax poetic a little bit about that experience. Like, how'd you even come up with this as a story?
Is that where we're starting? Well, I'm always thinking about, I was born in 1961 in Berkeley. So my whole childhood was the free speech movement. My father was a lefty, but he was born in 1923. So he was like a lefty who had like a good jacket or whatever. But he, and he saw the foibles of the movement and he saw the grandiosity of the movement, but he certainly supported it. And I remember coming home from second grade one day and there were all these like kind of quasi grown-ups in the living room. And I went away at the other side of the house. And my mom said, oh, the graduate students are striking now. So the seminar's in our house. Like, okay. But the idea was, and so whenever I get despairing about life on campus, I do remember that in my childhood, Berkeley, literally because of the students' valorous actions, mostly valorous and in some ways kind of silly, but c'est la guerre. The city, we got invaded twice by troops. It was really, there were just riots all the time. We were the really radical thing went on in the public school system. We were the first school system to integrate without a court order in the country. And that happened in second grade, and we almost got school delay. And all the national media came because it was like a feel-good story. And then the Friday before the Monday of the first day of school, the Huey Newton verdict came down. And everyone said, oh, we can't go to school. It's going to be riots. And there were riots, but they were kind of like exhausted riots, and school did go on. And so anyways, I'm just always, always, always interested in the young, and I fully understand it's not my world. I am 60. I hand the keys over, it's their world, and they're making a world for themselves. But as an old person, I have no
Didn't you
counsel.
just write a piece about how you're an old person now?
I did.
Yeah.
I'm getting all the mileage I can out of this experience, but it seems like I don't have to rush to get it all in because it's not going away. But so now you get to this age and you're not in the culture. You're not deeply critiquing the culture. You're kind of like a traveler from an antique land, and you're like, oh, so taking it in this direction. Okay. But what I learned from Berkeley is that the notion that what undergraduates are doing, extreme liberals will always say, oh, these conservatives, they'll label you a conservative if you question anything going on campus. And they'll say, oh, you're so silly and provincial that you think that what happens on colleges is important to the future of the country. And I just think, excuse me? Like, if there's any greater validation that they should all just be closed up, unless they're schools of dentistry, as we said before we went on the air, the notion that we have a country, or at least a significant percentage of the country, thinks what happens on campus has nothing to do with the future and fate of the country, is a terrible indictment of what must be going on campus, as if that's true. But of course, it's not true. And those kids in Berkeley that started the free speech movement and led a lot of other young people around the country, they stopped the war in Vietnam. They saw kids who weren't in college being sent to that war, or escaping through my parents' living room to Canada. And they changed the United States Constitution because they said you can't send us to war without letting us vote on the people who are going to make those decisions. And so when I see things like that, comedy, which is always the province of the young and is always the province of people who shock, to see that the young people have these sensibilities was interesting to me, very interesting to me. Now, that said, I don't think the brightest of the young people are choosing the campus entertainment. I mean, they're not the most, like, you don't see the campus musicians there. You don't see like the guy who's got his like outrageous podcast or something. They're nice, like student activities kids. So that puts a suppressing thumb on the scale of art, I think, that's school sponsored. But yeah, it seemed really, it's just the whole thing. Just being an undergraduate seems just really grisly to me. But so that's why I thought about that. What's happening if comedy goes? Then what? They came for comedy, and I did not say anything, and then they came for little tweet personal essays, and it was too late.
Before Greg jumps in, a little bit of background on your piece. This National Association for Campus Activities, they host an annual conference where a bunch of comedians come in and try and compete for these very lucrative campus spots. Sometimes can pay up to $2,500 per spot, and often you can get 3 or 4 schools in a geographic area and do them one after another. So you're, clocking out at 10 grand for a week's worth of work.
Mm-hmm.
And you speak to how the comedy is just so sanitized so that it doesn't offend anyone. And the student activities affairs people really will almost bend over backwards to figure out ways in which a comic might offend, and then they'll avoid that comic. And the comics know this, so they kind of cater to this audience. They're gone are the days where you have the smoky room at the bottom of the student union,
Right.
open mic night with the transgressive comedy. I believe I recall you talking to Yasha Monk over at the Persuasion podcast
Mm-hmm.
about like the days, the Berkeley basement where they screen pornography, for example.
Oh yeah, and the free speech movement, they had, when they took over Sproul Hall with Mario Savia, that great movement, one of the things they did in the famous Sproul Hall was in the basement, they played gay pornography, which was just, in 1964, the notion that there were people, I'm sure undergraduates didn't know what homosexuality was, and the notion that it would be that you would see pornography, and that the attitude prevailing in the, occupied Sproul Hall was, well, don't come in the room if you don't want it. You don't have to see gay pornography. This is a huge administration building. And that we can see and listen to and discuss anything that's a kind of expression, that's not a physical action, or that's not taking something away from someone else. So it all. So I'm always thinking about that. But it's funny when you mention these pieces. I instead of thinking of the content of them, I'm thinking of like the war stories of getting them published. So I'm trying
That's
to
why
like
you're
not,
like that. This is this is where we're starting.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the main dialogue in my head is like, oh God, and then the other's like, what was that piece even about? But there was a notorious editor who was on his way out who caused me problems there. But it gives me the edge I have today.
Yeah. Oh, and there are just a whole bunch of stuff that I was excited to comment on in that. One is the idea that what happens on campus stays on campus. I call it the Vegas campus delusion, and I'm not sure anybody really believed it, to be honest. But you do sometimes get this sort of like toggling through arguments about why threats to free speech on campus don't matter. For the larger society. And people would always say, oh, they're going to change when they hit the real world. And, people like me and Haidt and Nico and everybody were like, no, they're going to change it. And not
Yes,
necessarily for the better.
it's their world and they don't know better yet because so many professors have abdicated, well, I guess probably a core curriculum. But the main thing is, and I'm sure you guys are the heroes of all, you are the heroes of this and God love you, but I think that most people that are undergraduates, maybe unless they've taken con law class, which I would urge every undergraduate to take, that's the terms of service. Take it. That's what you get with the program here. You can change it, you can fight it, you can accept it, but just at least know what comes with the onboarding package. They don't know what free speech is.
Nope.
They just don't know what it is. And getting back to Berkeley, and we're talking about something that happened 60 years ago, was a really important thing. The kids wanted to do something that today's kids would be outraged if they weren't allowed to do it. The whole thing started because, Berkeley in the 50s was a super, super reactionary city, not just a university. It just rapidly became radical. And it started very quickly in the 60s. And there was just a group of kids, all they wanted to do was hand out on campus leaflets about the Young Democrats Club. That's all. And Democrats in California were themselves very square at that time. And the university said, you may not do that. You don't have the right to do it. And the kids said very logically, we are 18 or older, and this is public land. It's owned by the state. You have to let us do it. And the university was like, oh, and then suddenly the university, because it wasn't a case of trying to persuade the university into anything, it was saying a series of related truths that you could not maintain a university and say you didn't believe those things because they were so evidently true. And now I hear administrators parroting things that if they really believe them, that's just shocking that they would believe them. And that if they're just parroting, which I'm sure they are to save their jobs, that too is shocking, I think.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about some of the trouble that you've run into at the I wonder if you can talk about it at the Atlantic, saying that you sometimes had issues with editors because, I mean, for me, like I have to admit, I feel like James Bennett, right before his end of his tenure at the New York Times, did something that he did an article that really sounded like an apology for publishing Coddling of the American Mind back in 2015. And every time it's been quoted in there since, they don't mention coddling. And then there was an article about anxiety by Kate Julian, who's a friend, that was about accommodation of kids. Accommodating children's anxiety makes it worse. And I'm like, also known as, and it just, I kind of almost get the impression that the Atlantic, well, I doubt the Atlantic would publish something. I'm not sure they'd publish something like that now.
They would. I will just give you the open and shut on that.
Oh, great.
On that particular article, the editor who gave me the trouble was James Bennett. And I think he's, well, I don't know. It was a huge deal. And then there was another huge deal between him and me about Wesleyan University. And I felt that what they had done to a female student was extremely, extremely ugly.
What happened there? Tell us that story.
I was writing a piece about the problems of campus fraternities, and I was upholding I was explaining freedom of association and why you have it at some places and why you don't, and why it's hard to get rid of these schools things someplace. But I wanted to, this was before the big Rolling Stone disaster when they had a cover story that turned out to be like an obvious hoax. But I thought I want to cover a rape, but I want it to be a rape that came with a criminal trial. I don't want there to be any question of she said this. And well, it's one of those cases, I wanted a verdict and I wanted a prison sentence, and I got one and I wasn't looking at Wesleyan. I was just like, let me find a college so then I can show you how the fraternities chopper into these situations. And it was at Wesleyan. And so I wrote this piece. It's called The Dark Power of Fraternities. It's a very still read piece. And it had the first half was all this other stuff, and then the second half was on this case at Wesleyan, showing what can happen, and with the fraternities and with the college and how they serve one another. And so I'm like, this is a damn good piece, and I sent it in, and like a month went by, and then I got this very formal email from someone at the magazine saying James Bennett's father had once been the president of Wesleyan University, and he's saying you can't run this piece.
Wow. That's incredible.
Greg, James was your editor on Coddling, right?
He was the editor-in-chief at the time. Our editor was actually Don Peck.
He's very smart, very smart. Yeah. But I'm just going to say, I want to say under Jeff Goldberg, that would never, ever happen. Jeff, anything you see in the Atlantic that sort of holds a line to the things that people interested in free speech or diverse opinion, anything you see that's in there is because Jeff has fought for that and said it's going in, and that as long as he's the editor, we're not doing these things.
Yeah.
So
you're right. The overall, I think the Atlantic has really distinguished itself for being the highest praise I give to organizations or magazines or anything these days is simply to use the word serious. That I think they're seriously trying to take things from nuanced, take nuanced takes on stuff. And your own writing, I mean, it was a pleasure to kind of go through a lot of your past stuff. Everything from your great piece on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which got
and that was just a challenging piece. You can imagine the powers allied against me before I exposed
Big Rudolph was trying to shut you down.
Yes, exactly. Big Rudolph was having none of it. And now you guys are young, so you know this. They have that horrible thing called Elf on a Shelf, which is like this little surveillance elf, and he's always watching you and reporting into the North Pole. And I'm like, did Edward Snowden teach us nothing? Like, we're training our kids from the earliest age that Elf on a Shelf is monitoring their behavior for their presence. So,
and I didn't get to finish the range because I feel like listeners are going to be
sorry.
The hard-hitting thing you mentioned was the Rudolph piece.
Yes, okay.
Well, but also about about Lysol abortions in the 50s and 60s, which was incredibly powerful. And calling human resources to task. Being involved in the after the Me Too movement, going to conferences of human resources, people saying like, well, why does this keep happening? Meanwhile, I've been a little critical of HR because what's happened from a very different direction, because we have the situation where people graduating from particularly elite colleges have had intermediated experiences from K through 12, and then also in higher ed through a variety of different things. One of the things that Hyde and I are being told is that people from corporations all over the country is that people are going to HR not for sexual harassment, but for just any kind of everyday abrasion between them and other employees. It could be as simple as a disagreement. And it was very helpful for me to remember that it's like, right, and there is a very serious job that they should be doing. And
although they don't do it that well, that serious job, and the whole scam of HR, you go to these conferences and they're kind of giving you like, they're kind of philosophical ideas about people and how to treat one another. The whole thing is indemnifying the company against lawsuits. That is the entire thing. And so they dress it up in this idea that for some reason in America's corporations, like if you actually have such high-minded people, like put them up in the C-suite for God's sakes. Like what are you, siloing these people over in HR? But they're not high. I mean, someone might be, but they are not there really to help anyone. And you're always better off with a union, because a union's not going to like give you Disneyland passes one day and then eliminate your division the next day, So, but yes, to the extent that there's anything to do, and to the extent that anyone's listening, whoever has a problem that is sexually harassed, you call a lawyer first, because they'll give you the advice and they'll take your case probably if it's a good case. Oh, this is the sad state of America. Let's move on. Moving on.
well, I was going to ask on the topic of that's not funny, your take on the Chappelle situation, if you follow that at all.
Of course, I watched it right away. He's a genius. it's interesting because I had very strong opinions one way, and then about a week later, sort of saying that I saw great worth in what he's saying, and I still do see things that have great worth. But in a park in LA, I just was at a volunteer resources thing, and there was a kid under a tree. He was just at the park, and my son stayed behind and spoke with this kid. And this kid, it's a trans kid, and he's from the Midwest, and his parents have rejected him, and there's really nowhere else for him to go. And then he said to my kid, he's staying at, I won't reveal, a kind of a well-known shelter. He's 18, I think. And then he said to my son was like, well, I know this place and this place and this place. My son works at a nonprofit. Come there and we'll figure this out for you. And then the kid said, and this broke my heart, he said, but I have to tell you, I'm a Christian, and I know most Christian places won't take me. And it just so happens my son is a Christian. But I just thought, I thought this trans issue, it's easy to take it in a lot of different ways. But I thought, what, we are in a country where there are these kids and their parents don't want them anymore. And they don't know where to go. And they come to, in a way, the worst place you can come to, which is Hollywood. But so that was one of those real world experiences that really softens your heart and says maybe your heart needs to lead here a bit. But I think Chappelle had profound moments in that I think would have very much helped a kid like that and will help a kid like that. Because the great line in the show was when his trans friend is yelling up at him to the audience and heckling him. And Chappelle says, I believe you. And she said, I don't need you to believe me. I need you to understand I'm having a human experience. And Chappelle says, I can do that because it takes one to know one. And I just thought, oh my God, this is going to be so profound. And I thought later, after this kid's experience with this kid, that kid's parents, if they heard something like that, you don't have to believe everything about gender ideology. You don't have to know a whole lexicon of new terms. You don't have to understand. You don't have to believe anything. You just have to understand that your child remains a human and we're all humans together. And then I think that the most outrageous or cruel or unnecessary joke, I assume, would be the one where he's talking about sort of whose vagina is legitimate and whose isn't. But when you look at that line in relation to the ending line about all you have to know is it's a human experience, it's almost saying all that other stuff is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this is so powerful. And this is because what I want to say to the people protesting at Netflix, not every trans person in America lives in Hollywood. Some of them live in really small towns, in really rural places, and really have no support at all, and have parents who are so far away from entering into this conversation on the level you demand that they enter into it. And I thought, to have someone of his power, his coolness, his rhetorical ability. He's just a genius, and just being a genius is a real thing. I've known some. I can't say it takes one to know one because I'm not one, but I don't know him obviously personally, but I know artists who are clearly geniuses. I've known people who are geniuses. Kind of a rough road for a lot of them, but he's someone of such stature and power that I could see all around the country. I could imagine mothers and fathers and brothers and aunts and uncles going, oh, that's all I need to do is I don't have to believe anything. I just have to acknowledge this as a human experience. And I have a feeling that I think that I haven't looked lately, but I remember on Rotten Tomatoes until recently, it was still like 90, like people were liking it. And everyone said, oh, this is a sign of trans hatred. I'm not sure about that at all.
Well, we ended up making a mistake when my wife and I watched it. We had to break it into a chunk, and so we decided to watch the next 20 minutes like the next day, the final 20 minutes. And I told this to Nico, and he's like, "That's what makes it all make sense." And so, we left the first 40 with a little bit of a sour taste in our mouth. It's like a little bit,
cheap, yeah.
Yeah, and then suddenly when you see the last 20 minutes, you're like, Actually, this is constructed incredibly well. And so for people who might have listened to part of it, and I know a lot of friends who are like, I couldn't get through it. I was only 20 minutes in. It's like, you really got to watch it, watch it all the way through. And the whole sort of, what you're talking about, like understanding people's humanity. This is what Haidt and I talk about in Coddling the American Mind. Common humanity identity politics is great on so many different levels. Remembering that these are people, these are just like you in a variety of different ways, and in most ways, really. But you share so many things in common. And one of the things that happens on campus, partially because, and that when I'm feeling uncharitable about it, I basically say that, some of these departments seem to come into existence with this idea that all life is politics, so therefore they act that way in everyday life. And therefore everything's an argument. It's all about coming up with the argument that nobody can really refute. And that leads to a priority on sort of like arguments that will always win in dorm rooms in colleges and in classrooms in colleges. And those kind of arguments are common enemy identity politics. Which can feel good in the short run, but I don't think, but ultimately I think it does so much more harm than good, even for the people you're trying to help.
Of course, because as Woody Allen, God love him wherever he may be, or not love him, God does his job. God is.
He's still funny.
He's still funny, and I'm sure that whatever God's relationship to Woody Allen is not going to be changed by my opinion. But friends come and go, enemies accumulate. So by the time you've like separated yourself out into so many different finely tuned identities and oppose yourself to so many other people, you might start. I was talking to a teacher at a school, and they teach Catcher in the Rye. And there's a very strong movement of some of the teachers to say that the whole teaching should be about his white privilege. And I thought that would be kind of a boring lesson, because it's not really, it's like boring. Lesson begins on the first page, like he's at a prep school, his parents are rich, they live in the Upper East Side, like this is about a certain social class, we can all identify it. But if that argument wins this year in that series, or that sequence, you're telling every white kid in there that they don't have any humanity. That even if their brother died, and even if they're brokenhearted, and even if they're reaching out for help and having to transfer from school to school because they keep, bottoming out, and even if a teacher makes a really ugly pass at them when they thought they had safe harbor at his apartment, none of that matters. You're not a human being. You're this, and you're only that. And there's a lot of teachers with vengeance on their mind in K through 12. A lot of teachers with vengeance on their mind. So it's sorrowful to me. But it was sorrowful to me when they ran that Hall campaign about Beloved.
Amazing book.
A 12th grader, and he was in AP. So I could definitely grant, as I said in a wickedly funny way on Mar, not all kids are ready for the AP, because it's not just that it's not 12th grade English honors. It's truly speaking a college course, and you're going to encounter texts you read in college. And yeah, Beloved is an incredibly, it's about someone saying she'd rather kill her children than take them back into slavery. So it's not, but then this woman going like, and then my son had a nightmare. It's like, lady, your kid's 18, like cut the cord, like my family was under for like a year. We were under the complete, oh, let me turn that off. Oh, there's one of my kids trying to get in. Go away, kid. It's my me time. It's my me time. But we lived under the reign of something called Scooby-Doo and the Cyber Chase. I still haven't watched it because it's like the ultimate evil is to be found in Scooby, because my son Patrick saw it and is terrified by it. So yes, when your kid's 5, you can come to your mom and you say, I'm having nightmares from this art that I experienced. When you're 18, like there's kids in Iraq that are 18, they don't go to their mom, so the whole thing was very strange. And I've taught to 10th graders, I've taught The Bluest Eye, which is a Morrison book, which has very hard scenes in it. And to 8th graders, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is Maya Angelou. Kids can handle a lot, and kids feel a lot of respect when you say, I know that we are all too mature to have a problem with what's going to be in this book, or to make fun of it, or to laugh about it, or to think it's something to joke about. but I want to tell you now what it is, because I know you're in the 8th grade now and you can handle it. Kids eat that up. And then they get exposed to these great books, but then mixed it. That's why it says, get rid of me, cancel me out, get rid of me. I keep trying, because by the same token, because what I want to say is no one should ever set the English department curriculum except the English teachers. But then they seem to be a ship of fools themselves, so many of them. And I cannot tell you, like in this huge curriculum overnight changes in the independent school world, 9th and 10th graders being given young adult novels. These kids can read Baldwin. They are 9th and 10th graders at independent schools. Their reading comprehension is uniformly high. They're interested in this material. They could read the Fire Next. They could read a lot of really great things. And instead, the teachers' committees are like, well, here's a book, it's like a chapter book, and they're putting it in. So I have no faith in anything at all, except I don't know. So anyways, that's very bleak, I guess. But
Well,
when you're
public
60,
K through 12, like that's one of the things that we wrote like a 5,000 word piece trying to sort of like explain around through all these CRT laws, and they're always unconstitutional as applied to higher education. They're probably not unconstitutional in a lot of cases as applied to K through 12 if it's public, but that's partially because the state has some role. It doesn't mean they're wise though or well constructed, and it's been you're saying the right thing when you get dragged by both right and left.
yes,
in
yes,
some of these phrases.
exactly.
And
That's when you're winning. Yes.
well,
As
yeah.
I told telling someone the other day, I said, I was telling my nephew about someone put a really horrible comment about me on Twitter, and I'm usually pretty stainless steel to Twitter, but for some reason I just had I didn't even have a membrane between me and this ridiculous comment. And I said to him, Spence, if I want to feel like shit, I have professionals on call 24/7. I don't need amateur hour on the Twitter,
Nice.
The controversy with Chappelle obviously caused a lot of rancor internal at Netflix, and in that sense, it's kind of parallel to at least what I've been hearing happening at newsrooms about the publication of pieces. We know, James Bennett, bringing it back with him, and the Tom Cotton op-ed. Barry Weiss left. Andrew Sullivan left New York Magazine. I was talking to another writer at an unnamed publication last week who is looking to leave because he just can't handle it anymore. Are you hearing from these writers as well? Do you feel like and I know you work in commentary and you're probably not in a newsroom, but the internal politics of some of these
Here's
prominent
the thing
outlets
about free speech that's in the region of not our grand rights or natural rights or anything, but in again the human heart. The minute there's something that you can't hear about, the minute there's something, you just remember when you were a little kid and the grown-ups are talking and you just walking through for a snack and everybody falls silent and they kind of looking like we're not going to say it. You're like, what the hell are they talking about? You are going to make it your mission to find out, maybe it's just some crime they don't want kids to know about. But the minute someone says you can't know this, you can't hear this, then you create a secret knowledge. And then people want to know what the secret knowledge is. And what I always say about Chris Rufo with the critical race theory is the Times hate him, but the Times created him. The Times created him because these things were popping up all over the country, in schools, in workplaces, in municipal governments. People were sending in to various, I can tell you, news organizations, I'll just say, without even politicizing it, extremely newsworthy policy changes. And they were coalescing at enough places around enough issues that they were absolutely newsworthy. And the Times was going to just ignored it and ignored it and ignored it. And they thought they could crush the truth because this was just one man with an unaffiliated. I mean, I think he has some post at the Manhattan Institute, but he's not in the newsroom anywhere. And they thought, we'll crush him because by ignoring him. But people want the truth. People crave it. People are like, oh, I do sense, because I heard something weird's going on at my library in town, but I wonder what's going on there. And so now the New York Times, I will really lay a lot of the blame there. Chris, whom I admire extremely, I admire him because, and I think I send him $10 a month. God, I hope it's being spent wisely. Because I want all the news that's fit to print. I want the news. I subscribe to the stupid New York Times, the great cooking section, whatever, Melissa Clark, the sheet pan recipes, keeping it alive. But I want to know the truth. And I just want to go on his website and I want to see the documents. And because the left tried to ignore it, Chris Rufo has set the terms of the debate. That's how stupid the left is. The left, oh, we can just cancel it out by saying it's not critical race theory. They have allowed it to become the number one talking point. And it's an unwinnable argument. It's a capacious theory. You're never going to be able to say it is or it isn't anything. But if the Times had simply, when I guarantee you they've been flooded with these kind of documents for a year and a half or 2 years, if they had written reported stories, there, Chris Rufo would be making travel documentaries and damn good travel documentaries.
Nico, I really have to say something here that is not going to surprise you. So, I came from specializing in First Amendment law, so much so that FIRE actually found me, and I became the first legal director of FIRE. I was an intern at the ACLU. Like this is why I went to law school. And but like a lot of people, it was being a student journalist that got me really radicalized about freedom of speech, because you realize how fragile it is under those circumstances, particularly when you're an editor. And I'm left leaning still, more so back then. And when I started, there was so many stereotypes. Like the stereotypes about how bad the culture war was about as bad as the culture war actually is now. And I was usually like, no, this is exaggerated.
That'll never happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And generally, like my experiences with a lot of the media was actually pretty positive. My experience with even the conservative media was pretty positive, with some exceptions. But the only one that acted exactly like everybody warned me it would was actually the New York Times. And I was a Huffington Post writer for 10 years. This is why I was a Huffington Post writer for 10 years. In 2005, the national accrediting body of education schools, it became public due to FIRE largely, that they had a commitment to social justice requirement as part of their evaluative criteria. That essentially, and this I think it was passed initially in like 2002 or 2003, which basically meant almost all of the most influential education schools would actually literally have to do a political litmus test. They were required to before someone could graduate from ed school. And I wrote what I thought was a really thoughtful piece about this. And I sent it to the New York Times, and I was always, in the arguments with the conservatives, it's like, and then I got it in, and I was like, in your face, because FIRE actually has people who vote for different people working in the same office. And I got it accepted in 2006. And it turned out the chief editor was away. And when the chief editor came back, suddenly they're like, oh, we probably can't do this for, I don't know, like a long time. And I asked, like, I don't know, maybe 9 months, and this was
the hellish job. I think of all hellish jobs. Well, Dennis Miller's famous for saying that the second worst job in America is crack whore and the worst job is assistant crack whore. But I am going to say that the worst job in America is when you are the mid-level flunky editor who has to find the lie to tell the writer of why it's not actually going to run.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, there won't be any room for 9 months.
Yeah.
The midterm elections will really be filling up the page. You don't have the pages online, dumbass. It's like, that is one of, I think, maybe the worst job.
And then they couldn't even she couldn't even promise me in 9 months. The editor who had to say no to me, who originally said yes, was so disgusted by that when he moved on to this new publication called the Huffington Post, he immediately gave me a spot there. But we were trying. We still try to this day. We would send every press release at FIRE, oftentimes involving liberals getting in trouble too, but also conservatives, also the mid-range of just apolitical stuff, and nothing. We would get almost no coverage, for this. And you're absolutely right. Like if it's something that he's a scholar who wrote Once and Future Liberal.
Mark Lilla.
Mark Lilla. And one of the things he
Flanagan.
always says at the end is like, MSNBC, like if you paid attention to this, you could solve it. And this is
Right.
a real thorn, even just from a political calculus, it's bad to
Mhm.
have this as an issue that can be brought up. But so yeah, that's how the New York Times turned me into a Huffington Post writer.
Yeah, I mean, the coverage of our issues in particular seems to be driven by the politics of the speech we're defending. For example, the
Yes.
Chronicle of Higher Education, I actually they were running so many stories about the Nicole Hannah-Jones controversy at UNC that I went and counted how many they had written. They had published, and I get their newsletter every morning. I think they had published something like 30 stories in their newsletter, some of them repeats, but they put them back in the newsletter in like a 35-day period, something absurd like that.
Right.
And they're doing the same thing with the Florida situation as well. Both cases that FIRE has taken on that are abhorrent restrictions on academic freedom.
But I'd say on the grand scale of badness that we've seen, maybe like a 6 or a 7, so it
Right.
was amazing. It's like, because you like the politics of this, what about the other 1,000 cases, anyway.
Yeah, so it's the
Well,
coverage
that's
is-
where we all have to think, as white people. I do hear this very loud comment that you white professional class Americans, you've had your hand on the throat of real free speech in the terms of dissemination, because if you everybody at the Times, was white mostly for a long time they were almost all men. Even in my own lifetime, I was going back and looking at how they covered things, and so to have someone like Nicole Jones, who's so deeply admired, to have her not get, because at first I was like, well, why would any first year professor get tenure? But I think there's something about that particular position.
Yeah, it's like professors of practice or whatever, they would get tenure. The previous two, I think, had also not had an academic background and got tenure. So it was a sort of disparate treatment situation here.
And I know novelists who even have tenure in creative writing. I think they do, because they should really be fired if they don't. But so I can see a sense of speech is how we change the country. And you guys had all the speech for a long time. And now we're going to get the speech, people of not white, cisgendered male. We're going to use this. And so I don't know. I don't know.
But Caitlin, one thing I do want to be really clear about this is we have cases involving minority professors.
Oh, I know. Oh, I don't mean you. Oh, I know.
Time.
I'm always so happy. And when I see them, I'm like, oh, FIRE should only do these cases in a sense, because I totally know.
But we've been sending these press releases, like so often, and particularly when it's a case that's not sexy in the sense that it doesn't. And this is the funny thing, Caitlin. We cover all across, and people all across the spectrum get in trouble when we have a perfectly sort of like political correctness run amok case. That gets picked up usually by Fox News. And weirdly, when the New York Times started picking up our cases a little bit better around 2013, 2014, because they were getting more intense, that will sometimes get a little bit of coverage in the New York Times too. If it's about left wingers getting in trouble, that sometimes maybe gets picked up. We were lucky to have at Babson University when Asheen Fetzi was fired for allegedly like advising the Ayatollah, to attack the Kardashian residence and obviously kidding. I mean, he actually mentioned the Kardashian residence, and they claimed that, oh my God, well, this was advice, like saying like it was about the attacking cultural sites in Iran. Mm-hmm. Like Trump had been saying, we're going to attack cultural sites in Iran, and this professor cracked a joke saying, well, attack our cultural sites. I don't know what they are, maybe like the Kardashian residence. Obviously, joke. And this got picked up by conservative media as if this guy was seriously advising Iran on who to attack. Those might get picked up a little bit. The Babson one did get picked up by the Times, and we appreciate that. But there's this big middle of cases that, and oftentimes involving minority students, oftentimes, and here's one of the biggest divides, often involving poorer students. In cases that don't have that kind of culture war resonance. Yes. Oftentimes young poor minority students, and they don't get they get diddly squat for coverage.
Oh, I didn't at all mean to in any way denigrate you guys. You're kind of the only ones that are holding any kind of a
Oh
line
no, I
here.
didn't take it that way. I just wanted to
Yeah,
be very clear that the particularly so many of our biggest cases, like the Haskell the Haskell case that we have. Oh, the other thing is they have preference for if it happens at Harvard and Yale, it's
oh
really
yes,
important. If it happens
yes,
at a community college, not so much.
Yeah, it's
yes,
also
that is true.
Caitlin. I don't think it's also just about giving um, people who historically haven't had their voices represented a voice. Those voices also need to be paired with the right political opinion. For example, we have this
Of
case at
course.
Emerson outside of Boston right now, a TPUSA group, very polarizing group, what have you. They still have free speech rights, right? They were handing out stickers that said China's kind of sus on it, which is, teenager slang for suspicious. They were brought up on national origin discrimination charges at Emerson because they were criticizing the Chinese government. Now, of course, Emerson initially claimed that this was critical of Chinese people, but eventually in its finding report acknowledged this whole campaign was criticism of China. But they said, despite that, we are still finding you guilty of national origin discrimination and harassment because of anti-Asian hate being on the rise in the country, driven in large part by the COVID epidemic. So any criticism of China can drive increase in hate crimes, whatnot, and therefore you're still guilty of this. The coup d'état, of course, is the fact that one of the leaders of the TPUSA group is Asian.
Chinese, Chinese
Yes,
American.
well,
Okay,
not Singaporean, but their
okay.
basis is all it's anti-Asian. So it's not that they're trying to give these students a voice; it's that it needs to be paired with the right political opinion, of
Yes.
course. So
And God forbid that they should wrestle on that administrative level with maybe it is suspicious to have slave labor. Maybe it
yes,
is suspicious to have people in concentration camps.
Uyghurs. I mean, yeah, the thing that you always think about what's the thing that we're going to look back on and be super ashamed about
Hmm.
in the future. And for a long time, and I think there's been some work towards this. I always thought that sexual assault in prison rape was one of those things
Right.
that we would look back and be like, what? Why didn't we take this more seriously? But the thing that our grandkids are going to be pointing at us, saying it's like Hong Kong Uyghurs, like what? Why didn't you say anything?
well, and even right now in China, there's a famous tennis star, Peng Shuai. I'm going to butcher her last name. Who just posted on Twitter about being sexually assaulted by the former vice premier, who's good friends with Xi Jinping, and she's been missing since November, I think, 2nd.
Oh yes,
Nobody
yes,
knows where
yes.
she is. There was some sort of email that was set out by China claiming to be her, saying she's safe and sound, and I'm just taking time for myself. But you can see the type cursor on it. Like if you're receiving this email, you're not going to have. So she disappeared. Then there's Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Prize in I think like 2009, who just wanted to put out a document appealing to democratic principles, and he was locked up in prison and died in prison. His wife was, and I think still is on house arrest. I mean, part of when I think about the free speech problems in America, I'm like, you could be in China, but even in America, China is having influence over what we can and can't say on our campuses. Just Emerson is a
Right.
case
It's
in
proving
point.
the point of the sus. It is
Yes.
sus now at Emerson. But I kind of went down as an American. I was like, what the hell's going on? Why are we trading with China? I understand that we can't invade China, I guess. I mean, foreign policy being what it is, although if there was ever a cause, liberating concentration camps would be near the top of the list.
Oh,
But
and
so
I
I
think it
asked,
will be a cause in 30 years. I think in much the
okay,
same way the people ignored what was happening with the Jews in
of
Germany.
course.
I think
And now,
it'll come to be one of
ignoring
those
what's
things like
happening
the
to them
Great
now in
Silence.
America.
Well,
But
China
what
doesn't. Oh,
I
sorry.
just want to say, I was talking to somebody about that whole thing, the concentration camps in China, and I said, it's always a mistake to talk to a really smart person who also knows things because it's so disillusioning.
Oh, I
And
hate
I
that.
said, it's just the worst. Absolutely horrible thing to happen. And I said, what can we do? What can I, as a citizen, do to let China know this is not okay? And he said, oh, call your state government and say no more solar heating panels from China. They're all made by slave labor. Oh, now I'm going to pit myself against the environmentalists of California. I got so much life to live. It's just everything is so connected. And so what we need is a code, and we have a code. but people are trying to rip up the code is what I think is happening.
When you say code, what do you mean?
What code do you mean?
I mean a code of, well, that's, foreign policy is something different, but we have a code where we're allowed to talk about anything, and we could say, I'm an Emerson student and I don't like these kids who put those stickers out. I know those kids, they're a bunch of jerks. But I think it's extremely wrong that China transparently has slave labor right now. I don't think that says anything about most actual Chinese people in China or any Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, but it is extremely wrong. And we should all be gathered around to say, if you can boycott Israel from making the sparkling water, the only thing I think they make is the sparkling water that's even at Bed Bath and Beyond, you can't find it.
SodaStream, big fan.
SodaStream, yeah. So don't buy that, and that way you'll protect the Palestinians, which of course is a worthy cause. But China, we can't say they're sus.
Yeah, these speech codes. Go ahead, Greg.
And there is actually, and I read this in Vivek Ramaswamy's Woke Incorporated, which honestly, given his sort of bomb thrower status, I was kind of expecting it to be not a very thoughtful book. And even though he does, he throws his bombs here and there, it actually is a surprisingly thoughtful book about corporatism, and about how, and it basically is saying that most of the posturing towards wokeness, which is what he calls it, in corporate America is disingenuous.
Of course.
And that it's just to make a buck. And one of the many things I learned is there's actually a word in Chinese to make fun of us for wokeness.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to say it correctly.
Right, and better not, because if USC has taught us anything, mispronouncing a Chinese word or correctly pronouncing it could be a job killer.
Yeah, and USD, we've seen, there was a professor who said something about Chinese codswaddle or something like that. He said cockswaddle, unfortunately, which is not really a word, but he was trying to say codswaddle. And we've seen cases all over the country where someone will say something about they'll make a reference jokingly to the Wuhan virus or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and it immediately gets taken up as if that's an intentional racist attack upon Chinese people. And
Right.
Sometimes the Chinese government, they're kind of cultivating that, because it's kind of it
Of
looks like you guys
course.
are completely insane on this one issue, and it protects us, so go at it.
But that's where I think it must be so disheartening to be, when you were just talking about Fox News, sometimes I'll see a really great thinker and I'll say, what the hell is she doing being interviewed there? And I know, no one on the left will even have her on, and she wants to talk about her experience. And then Dave Chappelle, I'm like, the hell he is going through is not with Netflix. It's that people like Laura Ingraham are sticking up for him. That is a world of hell that I don't think Dave Chappelle ever in a million, how can he disavow her and then avow other people? Because we have these now I don't even know what the politically correct term is for people that aren't, let's just say they're not deep thinkers. Mm-hmm. And they have a few ideas, they're wrestling like a bone in their mouth. And if they can just say it over loudly enough, they'll get to do all these things and write their bestsellers. But they're horrible representatives for what we're talking about. There should be cool, kids. I don't know. It's going to be very hard for them.
I mean, Fox, I can be critical of it sometimes, but there was a point at which, actually, this is pretty funny, Caitlin. At first, when I first started doing TV, I was on MSNBC as much as I was on Fox, which was great. There was a sense on the left that kind of okay, these are our embarrassments to us, so we should try to address them hands on. But yeah, it's and I was just talking to Charlie Sykes this morning. I did a podcast with him.
You're a podcasting fool. Podcasting all day long.
My joke is I get paid to pretend I'm an extrovert, so I'm going to have to take a nap after this. But he was writing about this stuff he was writing about political correctness and that kind of stuff in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a whole bunch of people who were writing about this. Now, if you look at the people who are most critical of what's going on in higher ed, we're mostly either left or moderates, with Ben Shapiro as an exception. But a lot of the more serious critics are actually left-leaning people like Alice Dreger and me, for that matter, but or considered more moderate, like David French. And what's amazing about it is people will try to, dismiss us as being conservative. And it's like, no. The conservatives actually made this point in the 80s and 90s, and you dismiss them
Right.
entirely, almost like they don't exist. So it's part of this really childish way of arguing that if I could figure out what your politics are, I don't have to listen to you anymore. It's a
Right.
really frustrating heuristic.
Well, it's very, someone, I was talking to a graduate student in a humanities program, a once great humanities program, and he said, it's like they're trying to persuade me of something instead of just, telling me that here's some facts, here's some books, read them, come back, let's discuss. It's like they're saying things that are somewhat implausible to me. And then when I say, oh, why is that so? They just double down on the persuading of this thing. But these college professors, they have got to get their heads in the game, because I'm convinced that this decline in college enrollment, it's not just financial, it's not just malaise or despair from the pandemic. I think there are a lot of young people in America who are saying there's nothing really there for me, and they're not wrong about that. And I think that we don't want necessarily, and again, I support Chris Rufo 100% with my $10 a month. I literally support him. But it is a dangerous and volatile situation for one person to be holding that entire story and to have all the power in it and have it translate into a transparent political power. That's what the press is for. The New York Times, with all of their reporters and their bureaus and their editing, they have a function. And those things are to be so that there isn't one young person carrying all of this material and probably radicalizing people unintentionally in bad ways along the way. So anyways, with college, all these people who depend on their stupid administrative jobs, you'll probably be the first low-hanging fruit to go.
I remember Greg on the stage with Malcolm Gladwell and Jonathan Haidt talking about his book Coddling the American Mind, and saying all the stuff that's happening. This is kind of circling full circle here to what the point you made at the beginning, Caitlin, which is all the problems we're seeing on campus right now, they're coming to an HR department near you.
Yes.
So invest in HR companies if you can. I actually looked into it. There are not many HR companies to invest in.
Publicly traded ones. In-house, yes.
I should have taken my own advice. The stocks have gone up a lot.
But and I think you're speaking to Chris Rufo, who's seen this in education and in corporations. Just anecdotally, I talked to my father-in-law. He's in the medical profession. He says, I'm getting this forced down my throat in the medical profession as well. And I just had recently texted with him about a guidance document that the American Medical Association put out about how to talk about disequities in the healthcare system, inequities in the healthcare system and it has this chart of what the conventional language is and what the revision.
Oh, these are always good. Okay.
Yeah, and the conventional language, for example, Native Americans have the highest mortality rates in the United States. The revision is dispossessed by the government of their land and culture. Native Americans have the highest mortality rates in the United States. Low-income people have the highest level of coronary artery disease in the United States. That's the conventional language. Their proposed revised language is people underpaid and forced into poverty as a result of banking policies, real estate developers gentrifying neighborhoods, and corporations weakening the power of labor movements, among others, have the highest level of coronary artery disease in the United States. I shit you not, this is an actual document from the American Medical Association.
And
it's everywhere.
As someone who has stage 4 cancer, I don't want these people spending a minute on their stupid speech code. Back in the lab, find more cures for cancer. Do not write your little private language that is just ridiculous. And you can't figure out, it's like we've come to a point where the physician doesn't know which one is a man and which one is a woman. Like, I don't know what's going to happen to American medicine if we really are going to falter, to these ridiculous codes. And what does it really do? I had this in a piece I wrote. What does it do when you have kids in a private school and you have to have those land acknowledgments that the land was owned by certain tribes? And that's very interesting to me, of course. But if you're going to put it in a kid's syllabi, then you say, and therefore we are paying rent to the tribe, or therefore we do this. We have this arrangement. We are repairing our historical wrong. But to just lay it out there that, you are sitting on land that was stolen as part of the California genocide and you can't do anything about it. I don't know. I don't know where it all ends
it
up.
seems like just a genuflection without for the sake of it.
Since I did want to bring this up at some point, we just got going on talking about so many different things. Yet you've been very open about your health. Definitely, I being open about my mental health stuff is the thing that led to Coddling the American Mind. But with you, I learned a lot about from reading. One, we both have two boys, and the fact that when it absolutely broke my heart when you wrote about when your kids were graduating from kindergarten or something like that, and you thought that might be the last graduation you get to go to
preschool.
Can you tell us about and oh my God, can you tell us about what you've like? Do you think that facing your own mortality is one of the reasons why you're so brave as a writer? I mean, what have you learned from this experience, this scary experience?
I don't think people always say I'm brave, but I don't think there's a lot of, I'm just an essayist. It's not as though I could be, if I do eventually get canceled, I guess I wouldn't have a big career if I wrote the kind of things I'm supposed to write, because wouldn't be any good at it, Women's magazines were always up
for listeners. You've been living with cancer for 20 years. Just context for listeners.
Yes,
that's right.
So I always claimed that I would not be doing any learning or growing through having cancer, but I can't. And whenever someone says it, because I know a lot of people with cancer, obviously, like they often die soon after. I'm not being superstitious. It's just when you get to this much equanimity with the disease, there can be a sense you're not fighting it anymore medically, but. Things don't live forever. Things are born and they grow and they age and they die. And that's okay. That's okay. That's how I feel about it.
That one of the more powerful books I've ever read was Christopher Hitchens' Mortality. I don't know if you've ever read that.
Of course, yeah.
He did not live very long after his cancer diagnosis, and the book, doing Christopher Hitchens, what he did, he decided he was going to write about a book about his experience. And it's very sad because at the end of the book, it just cuts off and all you get are the rest of his notes because he didn't live to finish the book. I'm as listeners know, a big Christopher Hitchens fan. And, I recommend that book. And what's the other book? I can't forget it'll come to me. It's about being kind of a public intellectual and
Letter to a Young Conservative?
Letter to a Young Contrarian. Thank you, Greg.
Oh, right. Yes. They're not making public intellectuals like they used to.
I got to meet him before he died, and he was really excited about FIRE, and it's one of those things where you just kind of assumed, I should follow up, and
He's he in this era of cancel culture or whatever, I think he would be a very interesting voice to hear from.
Essential. Yes. I mean, he would be taking names.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Caitlin, is if you had read Anne Applebaum's piece in the same publication that you write for about cancel culture and what you thought of that. She calls the cancelers the new Puritans. Greg's always called them the new Victorians. But
yes, taking it back to our own. Yes, I think that was exactly right. I just thought every word of it was wonderful. I thought it was. I mean, I know her. She's
she took some flack for it. I remember on Twitter, which isn't the real world, or maybe it is.
It's not the real. I mean, my kids are always.
Well, Greg's an apologist for it. I read your article about how you need to quit it, and you're somewhat addicted to it.
I'm hardly an apologist for it. I mean, like my work with Jonathan Haidt's extremely critical of it. I just think that I've been able to carve out what I call a relatively nice neighborhood, and that you can talk to really interesting, smart people on it. But do I think it's been highly destructive? Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why, except for this one period, this one thing that somebody said, it was just, I had to remind myself, no, this is Twitter. The minute you just put your phone down and you just walk out the door and you take a breath outside and you're like, that's not real. Nothing that's happening on my little computer in my pocket phone that's not real, and those people aren't real, and they wouldn't behave that way or say such a thing. And what that person just said about me isn't true. So, but because of my cancer, I only have about 2 more questions and answers left in me because I get tired. I hope this isn't a super long podcast, is it?
No. We can. We're
Okay.
pretty much ending there. I had one more thing I wanted to.
We can conclude. We had all sorts of fun going all over the place. But Nico,
Okay.
I've talked too much. You
No. This isn't a free speech question. It's just I know you're a big Californian. You write a lot about California, and I just wanted to get your thoughts about California now. I just left Florida where I was for a week, and they had all these signs up all over Florida that says New Yorkers vote Republican or go home. And I was just in Texas too. You saw the similar thing, but for California. So you hear about all this California flight to these other states, and I wanted to get your sense of whether
I would never
that's
leave
overblown.
California. No, it's not overblown. That's why I told you I moved. I left LA, lived
Really?
in that city for 35 years. That city is currently closed for renovation. It's ditto San Francisco. Just absolutely terrible things are happening, but there's still great swaths of protected land in California. Anybody can go to Carmel and go to Point Lobos, there's great environmental protections in Northern California. Go to Stinson Beach. It's a very exceptional place. It's the most beautiful place in the world. And you go to other places and you're like, yeah, this is beautiful. Let me tell you what's in California that's like this, but more beautiful. So, but no, California's, it's not doing its best. I'm actually writing a piece about California now. I'm kind of stumbling about it. And that's part of why I had that recent trip. No, it's sad, but it's still the best. And these Texans, like everybody was like, yeah, we're going to Texas. And then they immediately almost froze to death in their houses, and now they can't get an abortion. So, maybe our, creaky old infrastructure, at least, I don't know, at least things are still somewhat working, because I guess Texas is just another land entirely.
Yeah. Well, I think we can leave it there, Caitlin. I know you got to run. Anything
No,
you want to plug that
nap.
you're working
I gotta nap.
Yeah, you and
Literally.
Greg does too. So I gotta let him go
good.
as well. he's all extroverted himself out,
Okay,
or
exactly.
introverted himself out. But is anything you want to plug that you're working on right now? I think on Twitter your handle is what, Caitlin Pacific, right?
It's yes, at Caitlin Pacific. Oh, because my Twitter handle used to be Caitlin Atlantic, which I thought was a pretty nice Twitter handle, and I was very proud of it. And then I tweeted something about a sex worker that was actually supportive of her, but expressed in sort of crude terms.
Blue language.
Blue. It was blue. So what happened was, I get a very long email from a very senior person saying that James Bennett has said, I can either take down that tweet or I must change my handle from Caitlin Atlantic. And that really burned me up. It burned me up to be a woman doing, and then to say like, well, they pay me, so they have the ability to do that. But no, he's not a friend of free speech. He's a friend of James Bennett.
Wow. Caitlin Pacific. I didn't actually realize that was such a the origin story there. I didn't.
I've never told it before. I don't know. You just opened a rich vein.
We're breaking news here. Holy
yes,
cow!
Exactly.
We're breaking news here. But it's silly that they would have you take down that tweet. I mean, you're a professional opinion haver. So
Yes.
you'd think the Atlantic
It's Havist.
Yeah, whatever. All right, grammarian over there.
I'm totally kidding. I want the awkwarder the better. Anyway, Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on.
All right,
I'm a
this
huge
is great
fanboy.
fun. Okay, fangirling over here.
Oh, and Esther the long-eared donkey is even worse in terms of depressingness than Rudolph, in my opinion. Like that story devastated us as kids.
Yeah, it's very bad.
We're like, Esther!
Who are those people? Why are they making these Christmas specials of hell? Yes, I know.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks,
Okay.
Greg. This podcast is hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. You can learn more about So to Speak by following us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast. We take email feedback at so-to-speak@thefire.org. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. Thanks again, and I look forward to talking to you all next time.